Queen excluders in the wintertime. Leave them on or take them off. Let's talk about it. Hey everybody, welcome back to day 5 of our beekeeping tip of the day. Today we're talking about queen excluders. Do we need to have them on the hive or not over winter? If you aren't familiar with what a queen excluder is, it is something that is placed on the hive to keep the queen in one area and out of another. And let me give you a quick example. The space where the queen is laying eggs is referred to as the brood chamber. Now you can be using deep boxes. Sometimes people use 1 deep, sometimes they do 2, sometimes they use medium boxes. And you might have 2, 3, somewhere in that area to serve as your brood chamber. So let's say you're using medium boxes. You may say in your mind, I think I want 3 of those boxes to be set aside for the queen and her, her brood space. Or maybe you only want 2. If you want to make sure that the queen does not go from one section to another, you just put a queen excluder in the middle. Now, if you look at deeps, for example, some people do what they call a single brood chamber setup. They'll have one single deep box, put a queen excluder on top of that, everything else becomes honey. Now we can go through a lot of different ways to set things up, different configurations, and we can talk about kind of the pros and cons of each. But today, very specifically, we're talking about, are we going to leave our queen excluders on in the winter, overwintering, or not? Now again, we talked about we're putting the queen excluder on to isolate the queen in or out of certain spaces. The primary area people don't want her to get into is the honey. We don't want the queen to go lay eggs where there's honey. Now, in the wintertime, the queen's not laying eggs. The wintertime is all about survival. The cluster of bees, let's just say right here where the mic is where the cluster of bees is. They will move through the hive and consume honey as they move. The bees will rotate from the middle where it's warmer to the outside where it's cooler. They'll gather some honey, bring that in, and it's kind of like a ever swirling kind of thing that cluster is going through as it's moving through the resources of the hive and consuming them and ultimately moving up. The fear behind leaving a queen excluder on is, let's say, for example, we're using what they call a double deep brood chamber. So we have 2 deep boxes, then there's a queen excluder, and then you have a honey super on top of that. That's a lot of honey. I mean, if that thing was really, really packed out, that would be probably way more honey than would be needed in a lot of places. Not necessarily everywhere, but a lot of places. So a lot of people will theorize that as that cluster moves up, they hit the queen excluder and that they will continue beyond that to consume honey and leave the queen behind because she can't fit in there. I think that sounds like a viable story. I think that sounds like a viable theory. Now, in my experience, I have overwintered with the queen excluder on. It was a double deep queen excluder and a medium of honey reserved just for the bees. What I saw in my kind of post-season analysis, because I didn't have cameras in the hive, but what I did see afterwards is the cluster appeared to have moved up to the queen excluder. Some of the bees went a little bit further up into the honey super and started pulling in some honey, but they did not leave the queen behind. The cluster itself kind of stopped at the queen excluder, and the bees continued to still revolve around the queen excluder. And there was still plenty of space, and they didn't break the cluster. I can't see a scenario where any beehive colony is leaving their queen behind. They would probably rather starve to death than leave their queen. That being said, let's just say what the worst fear is that everybody has about, taking a queen excluder off comes true. Let's just say that maybe you only had a single deep. You took the queen excluder off. You had 3 honey supers on there to make sure she had more honey than she could possibly ever use. And then in the spring, they had worked their way up into the honey. They consumed a lot of that honey to stay alive. And you find 3 frames that have brood on them, in the spring. Well, take them out, replace them with regular frames that are intended to be honey again for that season. You can take those frames out, put them into a nuke, put them into some other kind of hive, leave them in an area behind a queen excluder temporarily, let that brood emerge, and then you can repurpose them somewhere else. So if you end up having to sacrifice a couple of frames that you thought were going to be honey frames and turned out to be brood frames in order to get your colony to survive the winter, I feel like that's a worthwhile investment. So my advice is, while I have overwintered a specific configuration with 2 deeps, a queen excluder, and a medium, I have successfully overwintered that many times, I still think that the best way to go is to take the queen excluder off and let the whole colony just be able to move as one big contiguous cluster the entire winter. If she ends up in the spring laying a few eggs in a place you don't want, it's better to have her doing that than to have the colony dead. So folks, that's all I've got for you today on this beekeeping tip of the day. I hope you enjoyed it. If you wouldn't mind, if you could just real gently touch that little like button for me. And if you found some value in the video, please consider subscribing. We've got the podcast, we've got the Discord room, we've got a lot of cool things going on. Love to have you be a part of that. Outside of that, take care, be kind to one another, and remember that I love you, and there's nothing you can do about it. We'll talk to you later.